Welcome back to another topsy-turvy episode of Malum Markets, where we focus on Pokemon trading card analytics. Today, we are talking about specifically flippers. Now, we'll define flippers and go through all of that kind of good stuff as to what it means, but every single time a new set is released, flippers do exactly this. And I think it's super important to recognize, one, if you want to be a flipper like this guy yourself, it's important to know your profit margins and understand this stuff. But two, if you're a collector or investor, as we'll define in a sec, it's important to know this kind of stuff as well, because this is what's going on in the market. Now, we'll define these in a sec, but before that, if you find this helpful or any of our content helpful, please consider subscribing to the channel and liking this video. I would really appreciate it. Now, collector, investor, flipper, scalper, this is not going to include wholesalers or retail places like Target or that kind of stuff. More so the individual investor, individual collector. So collectors obviously are people who collect. I don't think we really need to define that too much more. They're in it just for the collectability. Investors, typically in this category, it's a little bit long-term, but investors are people who are looking to turn a profit, whereas flippers are also looking to turn a profit, but much more so in the short term or maybe even immediate term, as I'll define it here. And then scalpers, you'll see with this used car salesman, they're essentially using an artificial low demand in the market to just turn something immediately for a profit because you can't get it anywhere else. And flippers, again, is specifically what we're going to focus on here in that bottom right-hand quadrant there. Now, specifically, here is how we'll define flipping. Flippers look for deals. So essentially, they'll either look for a deal and then resell the raw cards within their large network. So consider a single shop on Instagram or card shops buying massive lots, then reselling individually. Or a flipper, as it's defined in something like real estate, is essentially you're buying something, adding value to it, and then flipping it, selling it, or renting it in the terms of a house. But for Pokemon cards, it's grading them. They're getting them authenticated. That's what's adding value to the cards. So flipping can also involve that. The key strategy here that we'll point out is first to market. And this is going to focus on modern sets where you can really see these examples super well. So first and foremost, we'll start with the Battle Styles Alt Art Tyranitar. You can see the raw cards here and the PSA 10 grades, and you can see the sales data specific from eBay. And for the raw cards, we're talking about hundreds of raw cards a month, whereas for the graded cards, the total PSA 10 pop is about 16. Total PSA pop is 25 at the time of this video. This flipping example is basic supply and demand. Obviously, the raw card cost declines over time. The demand is high, but the supply gets higher too. And same with graded cards. However, if you are first to market in those initial PSA 10s, there is a ton of demand, especially for the most highly desirable cards in the sets to make a good profit. Now, we're going to cover some examples here, specifically with costs, and this is assuming before PSA shutdown, but these costs will assume express grading, shipping, all of those fees, and I'll include that here in a second. But this is before PSA shutdown and before the price increase for this first example here. So $152 card in March, $75 express grading. These are some assumed shipping and insurance fees there to and from PSA. And then, of course, the eBay seller's fee for a total all-in cost of about $370. Now, keep in mind here that for these alt-art cards, especially the initial ones right when they come out, the top-end potential is super high. So yes, you're $370 in, but if you look on the top end with a $950 sales price initially, that is a hefty profit, about $580. Now, that looks great, but let's go through a worst case scenario because that's clearly a best case one. So let's say the cost is the same, $152 for the card. The price increase for PSA cards, so it's $150 to grade it, same shipping and insurance costs, and now with the lower fee from eBay, because we're assuming a lower sales price of $680, which we get there as the average price in June, that's about a $411 cost. So that cost is clearly still higher, but on the top end, we're still getting a $680 sale price. So that's still $270 in profit just about. That's still pretty great, even though the card clearly has declined in those initial values. So as long as you're in that first initial flipping run, there's some great prices there and some great potential for profit or to overspend on a card if you're buying things initially. Now, when we look at the CGC sales prices here, that's the CGC range. That's the CGC express cost. As you can see here, in case you're interested in comparing PSA and CGC, clearly there's a lot lower costs, but the sales potential on the top end is much lower too. You can see the $271 all-in cost there. And on the flip side, though, when it comes to looking at the profitability, you're really not looking at much. Yes, if you got that CGC 10, which is extremely hard to find, that's great, but there's not much top-end room there on the CGC cards. So before we continue this video, let's check a few quick rules before we give more examples. And first and foremost, be the first to market. And by the way, if you are the first to market, there's a high potential for profitability. But on the flip side, if you are noticing all these first to market cards and you're a collector, this is definitely not the time to buy these cards. You want to wait. If you're looking to flip, definitely this is a good strategy. If you're looking to collect, this is something to watch out for so you don't actually buy these cards. But this works for being first to market on the most desirable cards in each set. PSA has shown to have better returns than CGC or BGS, so it's important to use PSA. And the last rule that I want to cover is submitting multiple cards to mitigate your risk of getting a 9. As you'll see in these upcoming examples, getting a 9 completely changes your profitability, so you want to try to submit a couple to at least get a chance at getting 1 or maybe a few 10s, depending on how you're submitting, to force that profitability to be higher. And yes, of course, I know PSA has been closed, and I know the new express pricing at $200 that opened in July is absolutely crazy. We will discuss that at the end of this video and how the market will change going forward now that PSA is completely different and out of whack, and CGC is now getting more popular as cards are growing. We will cover that at the end of this video to cover with some specific examples. But for now, just know that we're going into the Gold Houndoom, just to cover what happens if it's not necessarily the most desired card in the set, but still very desired. This is the sales data for the Battle Styles Gold Houndoom between March of this year and June of this year. Only 6 total cards were graded, so extremely low pop, but hundreds and hundreds of raw card sales every month. I'll go through this a little more quickly now. Here are the costs. Pause the video if you want to take a closer look. But essentially, the all-in cost initially is about $216 for grading that original $70 Gold Houndoom right when it came out. In PSA 10s, right when those were coming out in May, that's about $159 profit. Not bad. Now, $60 loss is what you would have earned if you got a PSA 9, as those were coming back selling at about $125. So, again, you want to keep the acquisition cost as low as possible when buying these cards, but you want to submit multiple to mitigate that risk of a 9, where $60 loss is pretty big. Let's cover the Shining Fates Shiny Vault Suicune next, which is another pretty desirable card, but definitely not the main chase card in that set. As we know, Charizard is the main chase card in that set. But here's another example. Hundreds of sales of this card, and it actually even ballooned up to $276 in those first PSA 10 grades. February was, of course, when Shining Fates came out, before PSA increased their prices and closed down. So you're looking at $188 all in. Again, pause this video if I'm going too quickly, but that's actually still an $88 profit, which is not too bad considering Suicune is a pretty desirable card and pretty cool in the shiny form as well, in my opinion. But again, you notice there the PSA 9 sale at $170. That is really going to kill your profitability going forward if you are getting those 9s, which is why it's important to submit. But ultimately, the example I wanted to show here is that this is doable not only with the most desired cards and sets, even though that's where you're clearly going to get the most profitability, but for new sets, even cards like the Suicune are going to have a decent chance, if they come back as a 10, in earning some profit there if you are a flipper. If you are a collector, do not buy these first cards. The price will go down. Clearly, you can see that here. Now let's talk about future implications with all the changes at PSA. Clearly, we've shown that the top-end cards are super great for flipping with PSA, or for not buying right away if you're a collector, but there's a lot of potential for flipping. But now with the lockdown and the subsequent price increase, how will that affect these cards? The higher-end cards clearly are still going to be desirable, but for these mid-tier higher-end cards like the Suicune we showed, what is going to happen going forward now that the express grading is $200 which is absolutely insane? So will the $200 still yield profits despite the increased costs? Will flippers switch to CGC despite the clearly lower returns? Will returns increase on CGC flips with the limited PSA supply? Or will the same thing happen just on a delayed schedule at a lower turnaround tier with slower turnaround from the PSA times? Well, I think all three are honestly going to happen. I think that we are going to see delayed PSA returns eventually when those come out. Those are going to have some higher returns. I think some of the CGC returns will start to see some better profitability with the decline in PSA returns for these modern sets coming out. And I also think that people are going to figure out a way to make the profitability work for these things. That's just what people do. It's inevitable that it's going to go down like this. However, I do think there are a couple things to watch for to see which ultimately will become the trend going forward with all the changes happening in PSA and CGC beginning to grow. What to me will be the initial indicator of how the market is going to adjust for these graded cards will be the Evolving Skies full art alt art cards. That's a mouthful. And then maybe some of their gold cards as well. If we start to see more CGC Express versions of these cards, will they actually increase in price more quickly because they're the only graded copies available? Or will long-term, eventually, when the grading tiers that are lower catch up for PSA, will those then all of a sudden be highly desirable PSA 10 graded cards whenever PSA decides to catch up? Who knows? Your guess is as good as mine on that. But those will be the initial good market indicators to watch, as those sets are very similar, whereas the 25th anniversary set is going to be a very different set in and of itself. Thanks so much for checking out this video. As always, if you found it useful, please consider subscribing, and we will see you on the next video.